so society in the 1920s. We're going to talk about education, we're going to talk about mass consumption, and we're going to talk about the automobile and transportation industries with flight and so forth. So education here becomes mandatory in most states until you are 16 or 18 years old. Now, why the difference? Because it varies from state to state. It's up to the states to set their limits on how long mandatory education should be. So we've made great strides there. About 25% of kids going into the 1920s finished high school. Doesn't seem like a big number. It's not a big number. Today we strive to get, Salisbury strives to get in the upper 90s, if not 100% of our kids to finish high school. Inner city districts, they're lucky if they can hit 70% some years. It's quite sad. So big leaps in education come from Professor John Dewey. He's sort of the icon that we as educators look up to. He comes out and he says, you know, there are a couple of important things here about education we all need to keep in mind. Number one is kids learn best by doing, by engaging, by applying their skills in the real world, making it practical. No kidding. Well, that's why we have you do project-based and challenge-based learning. It's why we have you do labs and science classes. It's why we have you apply practical knowledge to your math classes. Otherwise, you'd all be sitting in all of your classes going, where am I going to use this? So learn by doing, and he also calls for education for life, that teachers should strive to teach their kids to continue learning throughout their lives. And teachers should do the same thing. So today we call that lifelong learning. That's the catchphrase, but back then it was just education for life. Other things, major things that happen from 1900 to 1920 are that life expectancy goes up considerably. Throughout the 20s, life expectancy got better and better and better, and we see the eradication of hookworm. That was huge. We were coming out of World War I, which had taken a lot of young American men's lives. So that was huge. And we also came out of an influenza outbreak. In 1919, 1920, there was a flu outbreak across the world that took about 15 million lives. That's more lives lost to the flu than were lost to World War I. So life expectancy goes up by 9 years. That was huge. All right. Now, further in education, we see this trial breakout in Tennessee over evolution. So a couple of things to know here is that you have the Bible Belt that stretches throughout the South, so Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and then westward to Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Missouri, that area, okay? So throughout the Deep South. What used to be the Cotton Belt is now the Bible Belt. So, and they are deeply fundamentalist, which means that they believe that the Bible should be interpreted literally. There should be no variance. You don't get freedom in your religious beliefs. Christians should believe this way, and they sort of set the path. There's no variance there. And they want to ban evolution in schools. They don't want teachers to teach that evolution is the way that the world came to be. They want teachers to teach the Christian mantra. You know, 7 days in and out, God did it, done. There should be no two ways about that. So Tennessee and 2 other states, boy, my spelling's wonderful, states pass laws that say teachers cannot teach evolution. But John T. Scopes, who's a biology teacher in Tennessee, science teacher, he basically says, I don't like that law. It doesn't go with what I'm trying to do. So he gets arrested. He's indicted for teaching evolution. So he's counter to the law, and he has to go on trial. So in his trial, his defense attorney is fantastic. It's a guy named Clarence Darrow, who's one of the best attorneys in Tennessee at the time. He takes the case. On the prosecution side is the prosecutor from the area, but also William Jennings Bryan, who was a huge fundamentalist. William Jennings Bryan joins up with the prosecution. Now, this case goes all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And what happens in the Supreme Court is that it's over. The case, Scopes. Well, okay, let's start over. Scopes is initially found guilty of the charges in the local court system. And then it goes on to the Supreme Court. And this is where Darrow and Bryan go toe-to-toe. And Darrow makes Bryan look like a fool. And the trial is extremely exhausting for William Jennings Bryan. In just a few days, 4 or 5 days after the trial, William Jennings Bryan collapses and dies. But the Tennessee Supreme Court overturns this decision, which is why it's inconclusive. So they had to refund the fine to Scopes and go from there. Now, mass consumption society, that's what we're living in the 20s. It's a booming society, right? The roaring 20s, it's boom or bust, right? We're booming. We're definitely in the black here. So what we have is huge economic prosperity. People are making money hand over fist. Businesses are booming. Unemployment is down. Things are really great. And we see some people sort of rise to the top as far as pushing the economy. And one of the reasons that the economy becomes so huge and so voluminous is that Henry Ford creates, in his automobile plant, he creates what's called the assembly line, which means that as a product comes down the line, a new part is added to it at each station. So that as a car gets built, you might be the guy in charge of putting on the left front tire. And somebody else might be in charge of putting on the left rear tire. And you're working at the same time, but that's your job. So it's not hard to teach unskilled employees a specific skill, because that's all they have to know. Left front tire, left front tire, left front tire. Okay? They don't have to know anything else. They don't have to know how the engine works. They don't have to know how to put the windows in. They don't have to know how to put the fabric on the seats. Nothing. All they have to know is left front tire. So that's the assembly line. Huge innovation in just the running of a business, let alone the car. We also have a period here where we're producing durable goods. You're producing washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, automobiles, and these are durable goods. These are things that you are not going to buy multiple quantities of. You're going to buy one, and you're going to use it until it dies. It's not something that needs to be replaced every week. The unfortunate thing for the businesses is that they kept producing vacuum cleaners and vacuum cleaners and vacuum cleaners, and all of a sudden when the late 1920s come, they're like, well, why aren't these things selling? Why aren't they moving? Why can't we get them off the shelves in Sears and Roebuck? Well, because everybody already has one. And once they have one, they don't need another one. You know, it's not like today where you have a vacuum cleaner on every floor of your house. Guilty. Durable goods. A non-durable good would be like the food you eat or the paper you use, something that once you use it, it's done. You can't reuse it, so you have to buy more. Ink cartridges for printers, that's a non-durable good. Wish it was more durable. Now, advertising. Advertising gets a big boost here because the economy is so robust and people are buying. The businesses figure out that, well, we got to put our product out there. We got to tell people about it. We got to market it. So advertising becomes huge, and one of the guys who is big in the advertising business is this guy named Bruce Barton, and he writes a book called The Man Nobody Knows, and basically he says that the premise of the book is that Jesus was the best ad man on the planet. He took a simple message, he got it out there to the masses in a simple and concise way that people could understand, and people bought into it. Oh yeah. So Bruce Barton kind of brings about this revelation that we all sort of knew, but maybe needed to have some light shined on it. And then you have the sort of social world. You have this advent of sports, professional sports, and baseball and boxing were your two big ones at this point. So, of course, baseball saw the emergence of a man named George Ruth, or Babe Ruth. And of course, Babe Ruth played for a couple of different East Coast teams, most famously what would be the Yankees. He was like the home run king at the time, right? He was the guy that nobody wanted to face up at the plate because he could just boom it. This is not the fittest man in the world. He was certainly loved food, but he could boom one out of the park, and it's a good thing he could. They called him the Sultan of SWAT. And then you had Jack Dempsey. Now, Jack Dempsey was your first big-time fighter. He was the guy who people paid big bucks in ticket prices to go see knock the opponent out. He draws the first, essentially the first $1 million crowd into an arena to watch him box. So huge advent there. Now, how did the world get to own all of the stuff that they own, because people aren't just walking around with all this cash coming out of their pockets. I mean, we still had people working paycheck to paycheck. So how do they get radios and vacuums and refrigerators and washing machines and cars? Well, they bought them on credit, okay? And we know what credit can do to somebody today if it's not managed appropriately. Well, people didn't realize back then that credit was serious business. So they would open up lines of credit at Sears and Roebuck or whatever the Hess's, whatever the local department store was, and they could possess today and pay tomorrow. So I can take this home today and I don't have to pay you for a month or 6 months down the line? That's great. Give me everything. Give me one of each. Give me two of each. But credit could get a lot of people into a lot of trouble really quickly. And that's what we're going to see happen in the 1920s, because everybody was sort of banking on the idea that this economy would continue to just roll in a positive way. Now, the automobile comes about with two guys basically involved here in the automobile early on, Henry Ford and Ransom E. Olds. And this would become, of course, Oldsmobile. And, of course, Ford is Ford Motor Company. Now, these guys basically operate out of Detroit. Detroit, Michigan became and is still the hub of the American car manufacturing today, at least on the domestic end. And Henry Ford, of course, was famous for producing the Model T. Now, the Model T was rolling off the assembly line one every 10 to 20 seconds. A Model T would roll off the assembly line and be ready for sale. Now, they could produce that Model T in any of your favorite colors, as long as your favorite color was black. So the Model T becomes the first major mass-produced car. It was rugged. It was reliable. It had a hand crank on the front of it that you cranked up to get the car started. There were no electric parts in this thing. It just kind of all ran together with gears and stuff. You could buy a Model T for just over $200. So it was very affordable to the people of the United States. A lot of families could have one. In fact, by the late 1920s, 1 in 4.9 Americans owns a car. That's great. It makes society mobile. It brings us to a sense of independence on the road. We were just free to go at that point. We didn't have to rely on a horse and a buggy and only go on a few miles and public transportation and all that. We could just roll. By 1929, there's 26 million cars in the United States. So we're booming, okay, in the automobile industry. Now, what's the impact of that? With the automobile industry, you also see the need for other things to support the automobile, the parts that go in it, and the roads that they drive on, the gas that you need and the oil that you need to run your car. So all kinds of workers are needed here: steel, tires, glass, fabric, rubber, road, gas, the parts, whatever. Gas station attendants. So you didn't pump your own gas back then. Things were really great for workers and employment during this booming of the automobile industry. Now, we see an oil boom in Oklahoma, Texas, and California, but we also see where the car industry can hurt the railroad, because who needs it, right? If I can get in my car and I can drive whenever I want and I don't have to wait for the train at a station and go by their hours, why do I need the railroad? So the car industry really hurts the railroad on one hand, but it booms the economy on the other. Food gets to market more quickly. People really felt a sense of independence. Now, we also see in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright in December of 1903 build a plane. These two were bicycle repairmen out of Ohio. They had come down to, for some reason, North Carolina provided the best conditions with the dunes on the Outer Banks where Kitty Hawk is. They felt like they could really put a plane in the air with the winds helping and so forth. So they come down, they stop in the little town of Elizabeth City, and then they head over to the Outer Banks to Kitty Hawk, and that's where they're gonna fly their first plane. Now, this plane was heavy. It wasn't like it could just lift off the ground lighter than air. That wasn't the case at all. But they maintained flight for 12 seconds that particular time out of the gate. By the time World War I rolls around, we're moving mail across the country by air. We're using planes in the war for surveillance purposes. was pretty good stuff, and some dog fighting in the war, planes going one-on-one against each other. Now, we also see in 1927, we see Lindbergh. I covered this in the previous video, but Lindbergh is going to fly across the ocean from New York to Paris. He was after a monetary prize of about $25,000, and he flies over in what's called the Spirit of St. Louis. That was his plane, and it's a successful flight. He becomes a hero to Americans. We also see the advent of the radio. Now, wireless telegraphy was invented by a guy named Guglielmo Marconi. Anyone want to take a guess at heritage there? So he invents what essentially becomes the radio. Now, the radio was used big time in World War I as a means of communication between the troops. Unfortunately, in World War I, you didn't have, it wasn't exactly wireless. You had to run the wire from point one to point A to point B, and the enemy knew this, so they would try to take out A, the guys who were laying the wire, and B, they'd try to shoot the wire itself, because if they hit the wire, they broke communication. It would have to be fitted again. So we see the radio in World War I, and by the 1920s, we start seeing radios in a lot of American homes. They listen to sports, they listen to the news, they listen to the weather, they listen to shows, politics, discussions, whatever, on their radios. And then by 1903, we also see the film industry take off. This is sort of the birth of Hollywood. There are about 500,000 people involved in the film industry in the 1920s. That's a lot. And the first film that we see is the Great Train Robbery. And the Great Train Robbery was the first mass-consumed feature film for Americans to watch. Ticket prices were really, really cheap. You could buy a ticket to the movies and go in and get a hot dog, popcorn, and soda for like a quarter. So it was really inexpensive entertainment for an afternoon or an evening. And then these were silent films initially. There was no sound to them whatsoever. And by the 1920s, we would start seeing what's called the talkies. And you would start hearing sound. One of the greatest actors of the time was a guy named Charlie Chaplin. If you have an opportunity, you should really look up one of his old films on YouTube. He's hilarious. Really, really funny actor, and he could do it with sound or without. Great stuff. If you'd like to see a mockery of Hitler in his days, look up The Great Dictator. Really funny stuff. But Charlie Chaplin's great.